Good morning, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Jackie Spear, and I'm really grateful this morning to be able to introduce to you the chairwoman of the National Transportation Safety Board, Deb Hersman. But before doing so, let me just say that this site behind us is one that has been an open wound for this community now for almost a year. And I'm hopeful that this will be the last time that we will be here at a press conference talking about this site, and that the next time we are here, we will be celebrating the rebirth of this community once again, where not only will this be paved over, but that we will see more concrete trucks, as we see behind us, pouring concrete and allowing this community to grow and prosper once again. A number of months ago, I met with Chairwoman Hersman about this tragedy and disaster, and I talked about the resilience of this community, about the pain, the anger, the torment that they had undergone, and how important it was in their investigation that not only must the investigation be thorough and speedy, but that I was hopeful at the time that she would be able to come out here, meet with the survivors, meet with the city, who she's met with many times, and to visit the site as well. She has done so. She is here this morning. We welcome her to San Bruno. We welcome the leader of probably the most powerful investigative body that we have on a federal level that investigates any kind of transportation accident. And this is a transportation accident in that it is the flowing of gas through pipelines. About 80% of the recommendations made by the NTSB are actually embraced by regulators or utilities or airlines after their reports are completed. So this is indeed very important. They are totally independent. They do make recommendations only, so it really is incumbent on the regulators then to implement them. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Chairwoman Hersman.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Spear. It is both sobering and also a great opportunity for me to be here today to meet with Congresswoman Spear, with some of the families, and also the local officials. And I want to tell you how impressed I have been throughout this investigation. Jackie Spear has been a tireless advocate for this community in Washington. She has been tough. She has pushed the pipeline safety issues in legislation, in meetings, in public hearings. She has really been very focused on this issue, and you all have a very strong voice in Washington. When Jackie asked me to come to visit San Bruno, it was a great opportunity for me to come with my colleague, member Mark Rosekind, who's here with me today. And Mark's family actually lives here in the San Francisco area, and he grew up not far from here. And so as a board, we are very focused on this accident investigation and getting our report completed. We have a number of parties to our accident investigation, and of those, the city of San Bruno has been a participant. They just were in Washington participating in a technical review of some issues last week, and we have had excellent support from the mayor, from the city manager, and from the council members. They have been thoroughly engaged in this process and attended our public hearings. And so I can tell you that you have some folks who are very plugged in here representing your interests in Washington and throughout this investigative process. I'd like to chat with you about a couple of things today. One is the role of the NTSB and what we do. We're an investigative agency, and we investigate accidents in all modes of transportation. Many people, until this accident, probably didn't recognize here in this community that pipelines are a form of transportation. but I don't need to tell you anything about the tragedy that occurred here in this community. You all know about that all too well. What the NTSB's role is to find out what happened and how it happened, and to make recommendations to prevent a similar accident from occurring in another community. Throughout our investigation, we have been developing the factual records, and as you all know, we've released factual reports in this investigation, specific reports about the metallurgy of the pipe, and we've also issued recommendations. In January, we issued a number of recommendations dealing with record keeping, knowing exactly what type of pipe existed on the system, and also about if you cannot specifically identify the type of pipe that exists on the system and how the maximum operating pressure can be determined, that hydrostatic pressure testing needs to be conducted to establish the correct maximum operating pressure. I'm very pleased to say that we're here several months later, and many of those recommendations are being implemented by PG&E, being considered by CPUC and by the federal regulators. And so we are indeed making progress with this accident investigation and learning things and changing things so this type of event won't occur again. I'm here today to tell you that we are issuing 3 additional recommendations. These recommendations came out of our public hearing that we held in March, and they're very common sense and straightforward recommendations, and they have to deal with emergency responders. I know that the chief and some of the emergency responders are here today. What we want to do is make sure that they have information before an accident about the pipelines that operate in their community and the characteristics of those pipelines, the diameter of the pipelines, the product that moves through those pipelines, emergency procedures, how those pipelines might be shut down. And we also want to make sure that if there is an accident, that after the accident, if there is a detected drop in pressure by the pipeline operator and they suspect that there is a rupture or a leak, that they immediately notify 911 in the communities where that pipeline operates. And so if they identify a problem on that pipeline, to identify the community where that event is occurring and to let the 911 operators know about that. We want to make sure that the emergency responders and the operator are in communication with each other immediately after an event occurs. We want to do this so that the emergency responders know what to look for. They know what product might be there, how to deal with it, what the evacuation area might need to be, how long it might take to shut that pipeline down. We think all of these issues are very important. What we found is that we've learned a lot in this accident investigation, and we want to make sure that these lessons are shared nationwide. We know that there's a lot of changes that have been occurring here in California, but we want to make sure that this type of accident will never occur again in any other community. We are working hard to complete our report, complete our final report. The goal for our agency is to complete this report as soon as possible, and we're trying to complete it within the 1 year of the accident. However, I want to tell you this is a very complicated and very technical investigation, and it's much more important to us to get this investigation done thoroughly and to get it done right than to get it done by an artificial date certain. And so we're working very hard. It's the priority for our agency to complete this investigation. We've dedicated a lot of resources to this, and we've fast-tracked this investigation above all the other pipeline investigations that we have ongoing. And so my commitment to Congresswoman Spear, to the mayor, and to the community is that we will continue to work as hard as we can to identify issues and to complete the report in a timely manner. You will be notified when our final report is going to be published and when we will hold our board meeting. But until that time, we will continue to communicate and share information with the media. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those.
What do you know about this previous leak on this pipeline that dates back some years?
The question is, what do we know about a previous leak on the pipeline that dates back a number of years? Several weeks ago, we were informed by PG&E that there had been a leak on line 132 in 1988. That leak had been repaired. That information was shared with us within the last month. It was not made public or shared with our investigators prior to several weeks ago.
Where was it exactly on the line? Right here?
There was a leak on line 132 about 9 miles south of this site, and that leak was repaired, and that information was recently shared with our investigators by PG&E.
How serious was the leak?
The question is, how serious was the leak? The NTSB is still collecting information about that. We have information that's been provided by PG&E. I think the issue of concern to us here is that this information had been requested at the beginning of the investigation to understand the leak history, repairs that had been made, the type of pipe that was on this line, and that information was recently provided to our investigators. We certainly would have expected to see that earlier in this process.
What did PG&E say about the delay?
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What did PG&E say for the reason why there was a delay in reporting this leak when you guys asked for it at the start of the investigation? Or do you have a sense of why there was a delay? Is it a record keeping issue? Or?
The question is why the delay in providing this information to investigators. In January, we made some recommendations to PG&E about their record keeping, about making sure that they understood what type of pipe they had on their line, the condition of that pipe, the inspections that had taken place, the leak history. We do not know why PG&E did not provide this information to our investigators. I think that's a question that you'd have to ask PG&E. We're glad to have this information now, but we would have expected to see it sooner.
What type of leak was this, in the sense of, was this a longitudinal seam leak or was it a girth weld leak? I mean, if it's a longitudinal seam leak, that would be indicating that they knew that a portion of this line was indeed had seams, whether it was segment 180. I'm just wondering, is the key issue here that it was a similar type of leak that, as opposed to what happened in the rupture?
The question is about the details of the type of leak that was addressed in 1988. I think at this point in time, what I'm going to be sharing with you is that there was a record that they had a leak that was repaired in 1988. It occurred 9 miles south of this location. Our investigators are still gathering additional information on the leak. This information was just provided to our investigators a couple of weeks ago.
How much of a setback is it to your investigation to find something out like that now, and is that going to make it take even longer to complete the report?
The question is how problematic is this information being relayed at this late date to our investigators, and will it delay the publication of the report? This information was provided very late in the process to our investigators. We would have expected to see this sooner. What concerns us is not that this information is brought forward. We can certainly take that into account and address that in our report. What we're concerned about is the process that prevented them from providing this information to us sooner. We certainly would have expected to see this information earlier in the process. We've been having ongoing meetings and communications with PG&E over the last 10 months. We would have expected this information to come forward sooner. This does go back to the issue of making sure that PG&E has good information as they're conducting their risk assessments. If they don't have information about what type of leak history they have on a line, they are not going to be in a position to make good risk assessments about what needs to be done with respect to oversight, investigations, replacement, repair of that line. Those are the primary issues that we're concerned about.
Recently, the state said that they had
Do you know if they were required to report this to state or federal pipeline agencies, regulators, and whether that occurred?
The question is, was PG&E required to report this information to any other entities, including enforcement entities? We know that there has been a request, not just from the NTSB, but also from CPUC and PHMSA, to have information about the history on this line. We are all very interested in the characteristics of the line, in replacements that might have taken place, in leaks that might have occurred in the past. And so all of those entities are parties to our investigations. They received this information at the same time we did a couple of weeks ago.
Just a clarification, you said you had 3 recommendations, but I think I only heard you say 2. Are there 2 recommendations
Yeah.
or 3 recommendations? Because I'm just
we have a very astute reporter who has asked the question of how many recommendations we have. I explained that we have 3 recommendations. We have 3 recommendations, and there are 2 issue areas. One recommendation is going to PG&E, and that recommendation deals with post-accident notification to 911. We are issuing a companion recommendation to PHMSA about post-accident notification to local 911 about leaks in a community. And we are also issuing a recommendation to PHMSA about making sure that emergency responders in a community are informed about the type of pipe and the characteristics of the pipe in their community. And this has to do with notifying them before an accident. And so we have 3 recommendations, 1 to PG&E and 2 to the federal regulator, PHMSA, but they're in 2 separate issue areas.
Joan, it sounded like this leak, this 1988 leak, had not been reported previously to CPUC or other agencies. Could PG&E be in trouble for not reporting that? I mean, face fines, regulatory action? I mean, are they obligated to report that kind of thing?
The question is about potential regulatory action with respect to PG&E's failure to report this leak. I think the question would really need to be directed to CPUC. The NTSB is not a regulatory authority. We're a safety investigator. We're here to find out what happened in this accident and to make recommendations to prevent it from happening again. We don't have any enforcement authority or regulatory authority.
Some of these recommendations actually seem somewhat obvious. I mean, do you think it's interesting that you physically have to come up with this list? You would think it would notify at 911. They would do those things automatically.
The question is about the common sense nature of these recommendations, and I think that the NTSB, during our public hearing in March, we addressed a number of issues, and we actually had your fire chief there, we had your local officials there, and one of the things that was very clear to us is that prior to the accident, that the community did not know that there was a 30-inch gas transmission line running beneath the streets here and beneath their homes. And we know that it's very important for people to have good information to make the right decisions. And so yes, this is a very common sense recommendation, but the fact that we identified in this accident investigation that information either wasn't being relayed or wasn't being communicated in a way that made sense for people and helped them to respond, that something needs to be done. And the same way with calling 911 after an event. Very quickly after the leak occurred and actually the rupture occurred, the control center, the PG&E control center, knew that they had a problem on this line. They had a significant drop of pressure, but they did not notify the local 911. They followed procedures that they had established about sending an employee out to verify what was going on in the line. But in this case, we had off-duty PG&E employees who were getting information from news reports to know that they had a catastrophic problem, and they made the effort to actually go get the tools that they needed to shut down this line. We want to make sure that everybody who's in this chain of response has good information and full information as quickly as possible.
Congresswoman, what they do is they look back and with some hindsight, technical expertise, say what should be done. The reality is, when you look at this thing, the CPUC is up to its ears in this for apparent failure to get these records. PHMSA is up to its ears in this because it apparently didn't do its job. And the fact of the matter is, I suspect from all the Public Records Act and FOIA requests that I've made, if you went to Congress or if you went to FEMA or if you went even to the NTSB and asked them to pull out records that are 50 and 60 years old, that they would have a hard time doing that. The question is, what do you do going forward on a legislative basis to make sure that people actually have these records, keep these records, so that the next utility isn't going to, a year from now, say it's going to take us 6 months to do this? Is there going to be something universally done to make sure that these records are there and that the agencies that are responsible to make sure they are there are actually doing their job?
This was a painful and deadly lesson for the country. And as Ms. Hersman said, recommendations were made, urgent recommendations were made in January by the NTSB to PHMSA to require all utilities across this country to develop their record keeping to the level that they knew precisely what is under the ground, or require them to hydrostatically test it so that these lines were indeed safe. So moving forward, PHMSA has now employed that requirement, and utilities across the country are being held to that standard. I think what's also lacking is a national database of information that would be reported to it by utilities across the country as they excavate a site, as they replace pipe, as they do repairs, to determine whether or not a certain type of pipe is problematic, to be able to understand whether or not the strength of a particular pipe is adequate. This is a little annoying.
Are you concerned though that the agencies themselves, forget PG&E, they're responsible, they're going to pay a lot of money and all of that, but it appears as though the agency system itself, the government, failed in its role to such a degree that you could have this kind of thing happen. What are we going to do about PHMSA? What are we going to do about the CPUC? What are we going to do about the government's role in this so the government is not at least as culpable, if not the ones that actually created the environment to allow the PG&Es that are under kind of responsibility to Wall Street to do what they did?
Well, first of all, we created a Pipeline Safety Act. We then implemented. Chairwoman Hersman has said on a number of occasions publicly that probably one of the mistakes, and that's my word, not hers, was that we grandfathered in all of the pipelines that were pre-1970. That was a huge mistake by the Congress of the United States in doing that. It is another example of how the utilities, in this case, those special interests, were persuasive to Congress to do something that I think in hindsight was not a good thing to do. Having said that, there is a Pipeline Safety Act in place. PHMSA has the responsibility to implement it. Much of that is delegated to state public utilities commissions like the CPUC, and the federal government actually offers up money, taxpayer dollars, every year to make sure that that function is undertaken. I believe that a lot of entities were asleep at the switch. PHMSA was asleep at the switch, CPUC was asleep at the switch, PG&E was asleep at the switch, and we have this catastrophe that we're dealing with today. Moving forward, there have already been regulations imposed and put in place by PHMSA that are going to require utilities to keep better records, and if they don't have the records, to hydrostatically test these transmission lines so they are safe. I feel very strongly that anyone who lives within 2,000 feet of a transmission line should be notified. It's in my legislation. PG&E has acquiesced to that request by me, and they have now sent that information out to all ratepayers in the PG&E system. I believe that all first responders should be trained. PG&E has agreed to do that as well. It is in my legislation. We now have the NTSB that is recommending that that kind of training be provided. They've now conveyed that to PHMSA, and I'm hopeful that PHMSA will now make it a regulatory requirement moving forward. Automatic and remote shutoff valves should be in place along high consequence areas throughout this country, so that we don't have a tragedy like this that occurred in part because it was an hour and a half virtually before it was turned off. PG&E again is taking those steps. The rest of the country has to do that, I believe, and we're going to attempt to move forward and do all those things so that Americans can feel safe in their neighborhoods.
If PHMSA was asleep at the switch,
Pardon me?
if PHMSA was asleep at the switch, what's to say that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration or FEMA or any other agency of the federal government confronted with the same budgetary issues as everybody else should be any more trusted than PHMSA going forward? What I'm saying is this not an endemic problem in the governments of both state and federal, maybe hampered by funds, but is this not a problem that we really need to take a look at so that next time we're not talking about an airplane that comes down in this community or a tanker truck that goes by? How concerned are you that the government is actually doing its job?
Well, I can speak to you about something that is should be close to all of us, and that is medication and medical errors that take place in hospitals. 100,000 people die a year from errors that take place in hospital settings. We don't require enough record keeping of that. We don't require that it be made public. We don't impose certain protocols that be put in place to address that. We've got a lot of work to do in a regulatory fashion. Now, there's always a balancing between a regulatory requirement and the cost of doing business, and those interests always are in some conflict. But was it not for the NTSB being created 40 years ago, we wouldn't have the kind of diligence going on right now to investigate this so that people can feel very confident rebuilding their homes in this community. So it is the number one function of government to protect the health and welfare of its people, and we have to continue to refine how we do it and make sure that we're demanding the most out of our regulatory scheme that exists.
PG&E has said that you felt just recently they told the state regulators about things that they've discovered about Rancho Cordova, namely that 2 of their inspectors were committing what they believed were numerous indications of altered documents. Now we have PG&E just now admitting that 8 months into the investigation that they'd had a previous leak here. It seems to me you've got a pattern of PG&E withholding critical information if they don't have it, or in some cases if they do. What's your belief on that based on what you know?
Well, I'm very dismayed to find that at this late date, PG&E is providing the NTSB with what is really critical information. This is information on the specific line on which the rupture occurred. It is only 9 miles away. There's a part of me that feels that area that had the leak should be excavated and we should look at it. I think the question raised about the fact that PG&E stopped the replacement of pipe 300 yards from the site of the explosion is one that still mystifies me. And there are lots of questions. One thing is really clear. CPUC has the responsibility that has been delegated to it by PHMSA to be the watchdog, to be the regulator. It is admitted that it has been remiss in doing its job. We now have an opportunity with a clean slate to make sure moving forward it is indeed the kind of regulator that the American people and that Californians in particular can have confidence in.
PG&E has asked CPUC for till the end of 2012 to provide them with the records that CPUC has asked for. So, in light of the fact that they're just now turning over this really important information, to NTSB, what do you think? Do you think that CPUC should grant them another year and a half to turn over the records they've been asked to turn over this month?
I think safety comes first. This is a record-keeping function that must be effective moving forward. But if you don't have the records today, I don't think you're going to have the records in a year and a half. Meanwhile, people are at risk. So, as the NTSB suggested back in January, if you can't show me the records, then show me the hydrostatic testing results. And that's really what should take place.
Okay, folks, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much. I have news releases on the